I've watched more movies in 2024 than any other period of my life, and that includes 80 horror movies released this year. Today, we talk about the dregs, the gutters, the movies that make the world just a little bit worse by their mere existence. I'm not going to be super wary about spoilers because I personally think it's okay if you get spoiled on these horrendous films, but if you're worried about spoilers, you can check the description for every movie I'm going to discuss in one way or another. Also, I apologize in advance if some of my critiques end up sounding repetitive. Some of these are bad in interesting ways, and others are bad in such uninteresting ways. Without further ado, let's begin. Number 10. The unfortunate thing about The Deliverance is that it could have been a good movie. It's a little Babadook mixed with The Exorcist, but removed from a white suburban setting, and honestly, I think that could work. The interpersonal drama kind of succeeds. We get to witness the struggles of being a single mom who is flawed and failing in a lot of ways. And while we can't justify her abusive tendencies, we can still see the complex humanity within her. Unfortunately, the interpersonal and psychological elements are thrown to the wayside in relation to the horror, which is subpar on a good day. While the drama is interesting, the horror is derivative and lazy. And then they abandon any nuance or thematic depth that they were even touching on when the movie very quickly becomes an evangelical proselytizing effort with a literal Deus Ex Machina ending. Then they have the audacity to pull out the based on a true story stick, which frustrates me to no end. I hate when movies pull that out just to glorify problematic people and or misrepresent reality. It's a cheap tactic that detracts rather than adds to the vast majority of movies that use it. Looking at you, Conjuring. Overall, The Deliverance had potential, but squandered it completely. Number 9. Totally Killer was a movie released last year to mostly popular reviews. It felt a lot like someone who made Disney Channel original movies for 10 years decided to try their hand at horror movies. It has its charm for sure, but I didn't think it was that great. It was maybe a little bad, but still a fine watch. Time Cut is the off-brand version of Totally Killer. The premise is underdeveloped and the plot suffers from everything you'd expect a time travel plot to suffer from. It tries to capture the nostalgia for the early 2000s, but beyond some fashion or musical choices, doesn't feel like it embraces the style of the era. The new Crow movie felt more early 2000s than this movie. It's underwhelming and predictable, but it might be a fun horror movie to watch for kids? But then they wouldn't feel any nostalgia. Honestly, I don't know who this movie is for, which I guess is why it's on this list. Number 8. It's a famous bit of horror movie lore that the production of The Exorcist was a nightmare. Injuries, fire, deaths, and more have been mythologized into the narrative that The Exorcist is the quintessential cursed film. Now, I could speak at length at how preventable accidents, rough working conditions, and random chance were all reframed as demonic curse for marketing purposes, but that's not what this video is about. However one interprets it all, it's undeniable that the narrative of a cursed film about demonic possession is a compelling one. The marketing worked after all. And so it makes sense that co-writer and director Joshua John Miller, son of Jason Miller who played Father Karras, would use that narrative for a film of his own with The Exorcism. And it's a great setting. Seeing behind-the-scenes action on a set for an Exorcist-like movie was great in the first act. Unfortunately, the end product we get is so generic, nonsensical, and underdeveloped. They try to explore themes of trauma, grief, addiction, religion, psychology, and show business through a struggling actor and his daughter, but they don't actually do anything with any of them. They introduce the themes and then nothing. And it's all just so dumb. The demon primarily controls lighting, but not a soul brings it up for some reason, even when it happens in front of the whole crew. The Exorcism has a terrible script and narrative structure, and honestly, just go watch The Exorcist instead. Number 7. Werewolves is almost a so bad it's good camp classic. The premise is that some way, somehow, everyone has become a werewolf susceptible to supermoons, and that apparently the year before, 1 billion people became werewolves and went on a rampage. We don't get to see that, that's just part of the initial title card. What we end up getting is if you added werewolves to The Purge, which honestly sounds like a great time. When they transform, the werewolves keep the accessories, face paint, or dyed hair of their human form, which is just such an unnecessary detail that I find hilarious. Why wouldn't this movie have werewolf sonas? Everything is so stupid and silly, I could have had some real fun with it. That would have saved it from this list if it weren't so terribly boring. Most of the movie is either humans standing around doing nothing, or werewolves standing around doing nothing. Also, the werewolves are practical, which is neat, but that means that anytime they move, it's like a Chuck E. Cheese animatronic instead of a vicious predator. There's a werewolf fight scene in the climax, and it's amazingly underwhelming. The characters are blank pages devoid of personalities, and there's a sickening amount of lens flare. This whole movie is just a goddamn mess. Honestly, I think more movies need to embrace being trashy, campy schlock instead of trying to be something better than you are and ending up so much worse. Number 6. The Strangers isn't a perfect movie, but it has some creepy moments and has established itself as a pinnacle of home invasion horror. So what if, in the year of our Lord 2024, we remade it, but made everything just a bit worse? And thus, The Strangers Chapter 1 was created. I genuinely can't think of a single reason that you would watch this over the original. It's shallow, stupid, cliche, and frustrating. The fact that they're making a trilogy out of this is horrendous. That is a threat on my well-being. Even the one iconic line from The Strangers that it's remembered for, this movie fucks that up. It's one thing to be bad quality, it's another to be bad quality and abysmally unoriginal. Number 5. Nick Frost is great, and he plays a captivating villain in Black Cab. He's unstable and murderous while also having moments of sincere heart. But sadly, Nick Frost isn't enough to save this truly awful film. Our protagonists are a struggling married couple who are either boring or frustrating, never sympathetic or interesting. The ghost girl they introduce, in addition to feeling unnecessary, has some of the cheesiest, low-quality effects and scares I've ever seen. It straight up feels like what I'd find in a stock video library. Poor writing and poor editing further bring down this movie, if that's even possible. If you want to watch some Nick Frost, go rewatch Shaun of the Dead, or maybe Getaway that's coming out next month will be good. Number 4. When it comes to shark-based horror movies, you can go one of two ways. You could try to be the next Jaws. Focus on the humanity of your characters, the personal and society effects of the monster, the ramifications of every action or inaction. Or you can try to be the next Sharknado. Over-the-top schlock that is designed to create enjoyable and memorable moments over psychological depth or making much sense. For what it's worth, I think that either can work if you commit to it enough and have the right script. So which path does Under Paris take? Well, kind of both and kind of neither. It mostly feels like a French Jaws knockoff with worse writing and less developed characters, but has a few crazy moments that could be fun if they didn't feel so tonally inconsistent with the rest of the movie. And then, in the final 10 minutes, they go full Sharknado over-the-top craziness. They have the sharks flood Paris and rapidly spread throughout the whole world. It's a fun little sequence, but it leaves me wondering if they were willing to get wild and wacky in the final 10 minutes, then why did I have to endure the previous 90 minutes of boring, uninteresting slop? Why couldn't it have just been fun the whole time? Bad CGI, worse characters, and not nearly enough camp. The worst 3 are all kind of grouped together, so before we talk about them, I want to go over some dishonorable mentions. These movies aren't the worst of the worst, but they're still bad, and I want to talk about them. I think I just need to come to terms that the Terrifier franchise isn't for me. I'm genuinely pleased that this violent indie slasher can go toe-to-toe at the box office with some established names, but all of the movies have just underwhelmed me. Art the Clown is fantastic, but I'd enjoy short-form vignettes much more than having him crammed into 2-hour movies that I don't care about. In the case of Terrifier 3, 2/3 of the movie felt like a directionless slog, while the last third is rushed and underdeveloped. I don't care about the characters or the lore at all. There's some fun, violent spectacle at times, but for the most part, I just found this movie boring. Trap is an extremely M. Night Shyamalan movie. The performances are strange, the plot is winding and illogical, and yet the whole thing has a unique charm to it. The story is a big cat and mouse game with a father/cunning serial killer as its focus. It feels a lot like Death Note, but instead of Light Yagami, it's M. Night Shyamalan. And instead of L, it's also M. Night Shyamalan. It's some trashy fun, but also mostly just an advertisement for his daughter's music career. Or at least one of his daughters. Because his other daughter, Ishana Night Shyamalan, was busy making her directorial debut with The Watchers. Here's the thing about The Watchers. It could have been an interesting psychological horror about strangers coping with an unfathomable and dangerous situation. It could have been a horrific meta-reflection on film, reality TV, and the increasingly omnipresent sense that we must always play to an audience. It could have been a dark fantasy about changelings and fae sowing discord and paranoia. Instead, it's an awkward blend of the three that doesn't sufficiently commit to any of them enough to make an interesting point or interesting plot. Combine this with the awkward dialogue and significant plot contrivances, and The Watchers just doesn't deliver. Y2K's on this list just to show that although I love me some A24, they're not all winners. I'm down for some stupid lowbrow comedy, but it needs to actually be funny instead of relentlessly referential. If you've seen anyone else's list of worst 2024 horror movies, there's one movie you might be expecting to be in my bottom 10 but isn't, and that's The Mousetrap. It's an amateurish supernatural slasher capitalizing on the fact that Steamboat Willie entered the public domain. It might be the lowest rated movie of the year, it's so bad. And yet, when I watched it, I actually enjoyed myself. For me, this is the only so bad it's good horror movie of 2024. It has a great arcade setting that I enjoy and had me laughing my ass off throughout. Often I'd be laughing at some moments that were peak trash, just absolute garbage, but other times, there were some lines or moments of editing that I genuinely found well done and humorous. So, this is a lie! The Mousetrap isn't a dishonorable mention, it's a secret honorable mention, and I will not be ashamed of this opinion. The final dishonorable mention is largely the opposite of The Mousetrap. Speak No Evil is well produced, has a solid story, a great performance by James McAvoy, and I'd go so far as to say that most people who enjoy horror or thrillers would enjoy this movie. So why is it on this list? Well, that's because while I was watching it, it frustrated me more than anything else. You see, Speak No Evil is actually a remake of a 2022 Danish movie of the same name. The original has plenty of flaws that the new version polishes over, but despite its flaws, it remains memorable and unique for me because of the ending. I won't spoil it, but man, is it bleak. Overwhelmingly bleak. The remake decides to change the ending and transform this psychological horror into an action-packed climax with a happy, or at least happier, ending. But that has me questioning what was the point of remaking it in the first place? The singular thing that made the original Speak No Evil special was its horrific ending. It's the payoff of the discomfort of the first two acts. So tell me why you would keep the first two acts almost the exact same structurally, but then change the ending to make it more palatable for the general public. Speak No Evil is a fine movie in isolation, but it's irritating how it can take an interesting movie that's admittedly imperfect and then strip the identity away from it. Most will probably enjoy this movie, and that's alright, but I can't help but see it in the shadow of the original. And somehow, ladies and gentlemen, even with all of this in mind, this was the best movie released by Blumhouse this year. Numbers 3, 2, and 1. We're bundling the worst 3 movies together because Night Swim, Imaginary, and Afraid are all bad in very similar ways, and what do you know, they were all produced by Blumhouse. I don't think it will come as a surprise to anyone that I'm not a fan of the movies Blumhouse tends to produce lately. I have a nice long video deconstructing why their biggest hit last year was so awful, but even I didn't predict that they would be able to take the bottom 3 spots together. Strictly speaking, if you want an order for them, I'll say that Night Swim is 3rd, Imaginary is 2nd, and Afraid is the #1 worst horror movie of 2024. But honestly, they're close enough that I think it's more appropriate for them to all share the title. Let's talk about each of them, starting with Night Swim. When I watched Night Swim, I thought to myself that while it was a disappointing movie, the premise of a haunted or spooky swimming pool could work as a nice short film, only to find out that that's what it started out as. You can easily find the original, just a simple 5-minute spook that has a straightforward idea and executes it well, nice and easy. Well, when you stretch that out to 100 minutes, you have to add a lot of bullcrap you wouldn't have otherwise. The plot is poorly justified, paced, and conceptualized. It just feels off on every layer of construction. So much of this movie is just people vibing by the pool, kind of hanging out, but with some scary music over it. I think a lot of people dismiss this movie and argue that it was destined to be bad with a premise like Haunted Pool, but I disagree. While there were obvious limitations, I think if it had more creative scripting and it was weirder and less generic, it could have been something niche but cool. Let's move on to Imaginary. A little girl has a creepy imaginary friend that is threatening to trap her in the never ever. Okay, solid start. Once again, with good writing and or some audacious and unique storytelling, this premise could be dope. But yet again, we get neither. Instead, we get generic execution combined with a bad plot, pacing, dialogue, and characters. Everyone is stupid and makes nonsensical decisions, the story is extremely predictable and formulaic, and the script overuses sarcasm to show how witty its characters are, even when it really doesn't fit. If you're thinking of watching this, just watch something like Coraline instead. It handles similar themes and visuals in such a better and more original way. And finally, we have Afraid. My God, this is one of the most bland and lifeless movies I have ever seen. The acting is stilted, though I think that's largely because of the script and direction. The dialogue is horrible, the visuals are bad, and it has one of the worst soundscapes that I have ever heard. It's just so monotonous. The narrative structure was in shambles. It seemed like they had no idea how to meaningfully develop or blend together the plot points they were introducing into something coherent, meaningful, and powerful. Afraid falls into the trap of technology just being magic, which is one of the most annoying tropes in evil AI stories. On the whole, this felt like what would happen if the Disney Channel made a Black Mirror episode but then added 60 minutes of filler to get it into theaters. I genuinely struggled to finish this one, it's just so bad. And there we have it. Congratulations, Blumhouse, for getting the clean sweep of bronze, silver, and gold this year. Please, for my sake, stop this awful streak you're on and produce better movies, I beg you. I don't want to see such a dominant performance on next year's list. With all this negativity, I feel the need to say that 2024 was still a stellar year for horror movies despite all these duds. I loved more movies than I hated, and I made a top 10 list that you can watch now. Or if you want an even deeper look into horror movies of 2024, I released a bonus video on my Patreon ranking all 80 or so horror movies that I've seen and talking about them. Check that out, you can yell at me about what movies should be ranked higher or lower. Also, let me know in the comments what your least favorite horror movie released this year was, or you can just point out how awful my list is. That works too. Regardless, thanks for watching.